يوم بيحكولي صبر سلاحي واخر صبر الموت، والكل شايف بس لا مش فارق، صوتي حياة وانا واقف وحدي، العالم ضدي وانا مخشى، سلبوني روحي مفتاح البيت في قلبي وانا راجع وبايدي ولدي، ولو كل العالم كان ضدي انا راجع يا بلادي راجع.
If any facade still existed, that Israel exists and operates as a democracy which has and maintains respect for international law, international rules-based order, this has been dismantled systematically over the last year, over the last 15 months. But this facade that it's developed is, over 100 years in the making, far preceding the official establishment of what we now know as Israel. The Zionist movement understood that in order to succeed in its settler program, it required the development and dissemination of popular narratives. So unlike a colonial regime, like the British Mandate, for example, in Palestine, settler colonial regimes seek a permanence in a territory. They don't seek to just simply exploit the native people, exploit their land, extract their resources. They seek to remove and replace the native people, and ultimately stay in that territory for as long as they can, ideally permanently. So therefore, all settler regimes go through this process of establishing permanence and transforming their identities over time, from a settler regime to a modern, legitimate state. And being seen this way by the world is incredibly important for their project, for their program. Now, this is done in a variety of ways and has been done in a variety of ways by various settler regimes all over the world. But the curation and design of narratives is what allows any step of this process of permanence to take place. So, for example, establishing legitimacy through the integration into world systems and being, understood as a legitimate economic and political partner, the adoption of seemingly legitimate systems of justice, also the curation of myths surrounding democracy, surrounding the rule of law, etc. But, for Israel, there have been monumental setbacks in this process over the last year. A process that, again, has been in formation for decades, if not over 100 years. Specifically, everything that is currently happening in the ongoing cases at the ICJ, at the ICC, its deteriorating status at the United Nations. But some of the ways in which this narrative enables this process of permanence is notably through the rewriting of history. And this is what I'm going to be talking about mostly in my segment today, which usually always kind of accompanies a founding myth, a myth of the foundation of the state, of the settlement, revoking the indigeneity from the indigenous people and instead bestowing it upon themselves. And once again, the integration of their historic and brutal modus operandi into legitimate forms of rule and government. For example, in Israel's case, this is, what has remained for a long time their historical narrative is this idea of a land without a people, for a people without a land, a narrative which is largely maintained today. I mean, something that I go back to over these last few months is, just a few months ago during a Kamala Harris rally in Michigan, Bill Clinton was invited to speak. And something interesting that he decided to speak about in terms of Palestine, with a crowd of largely Arabs, because they're in Michigan, which is, a densely Arab area, but also a lot of Democrats that are sympathetic with Palestine. He pushed these narratives that you think you only hear about in history books when you're reading, accounts of David Ben-Gurion or Chaim Weizmann or any of these people. But he said something along the lines of, I got news for the Palestinians, but the Jews were there first. Along with praising David Ben-Gurion about how he had successfully created a garden in the desert. So these narratives that are so entrenched in colonialism and brutal violence and ethnic cleansing, these Nakba era narratives are actually, turns out we've never actually evolved past those brutal histories at all, that these narratives stay relevant and contemporary, and we still are immersed and living amongst this history, whether or not we recognize it, but they're being very bold about it. Another way, a priority that I find when it comes to reconstructing and reconsidering narratives that we engage with is that, reclaiming historical narratives in particular disrupts this process of permanence for a settler regime. And particularly Israel's assertion that it is no longer a settler colonial entity, that it never really existed as a settler colonial entity. But if we use its own legal frameworks, we can completely deconstruct this point that it heavily relies on. So, for example, the subject of prisoners has been a pivotal issue throughout this genocide. Just yesterday we saw the release of 114 Palestinian men, many of whom had life sentences in Israeli detention or Israeli prisons. But if we take a closer look at the mechanisms which continue to be used to arrest, to detain, to torture, and contain Palestinians, whether it's in prisons, whether it's in other containment methods like curfews, siege, these things, we'll see that Israel really, its attempt to outgrow its violent settler roots has particularly failed in this regard. So again, when we're speaking about the over 100 Palestinians released yesterday, they were all of them were detained using colonial British policy. In the colonial relics that are the Israeli military court system, which again was founded by the British mandates, the Defense Military Court Regulations of 1937. So again, we continue to be immersed in this history, and it's important that we talk about it this way, that Israel has never evolved past the point of this historic settler entity, that it has not moved past the thinking, let alone the policy of the Nakba era, let alone the British Mandate period. Another timely example is that of military curfews. Jenin has just undergone many military curfews in the last few months. And the military curfews, which Jenin finds itself subjected to time and time again, and other places, I'm getting a call, and other places throughout the occupied West Bank, find their basis in the Defense Emergency Regulations, specifically those of 1945. So when we assert this history and when we reclaim these narratives, and more importantly, assert a Palestinian narrative, we disrupt this process of permanence for Israel and expose Israel for what it truly is, and what it has always been. And that's not a democracy. And it's not an oasis, a Western modern civilized oasis in a sea of barbaric and backwards Middle Easterns, but an eliminatory settler regime which seeks nothing but the eradication of the indigenous people and the theft of all of their land.
So at its core, and I think that's what you're alluding to encouraging our viewers and listeners to be able to understand that all of the practices that Israel's putting forward, even right now, is all based on settler colonial ideology, and that is the root of where they are today. And that's the root of all of their actions, and that's the root of whatever they might disguise it as, in terms of the international media and whatever. That is the root, and that's what our viewers should understand better in order to be able to tackle them head on.
Absolutely. And engaging with it in this regard. I think sometimes we unintentionally legitimize Israel as a democracy or as an entity that would respect international law when we engage with it in a way where we assume that this is that it makes logical sense for Israel to follow international law, or it makes logical sense for Israel to respect human rights. Because again, unintentionally, what we're doing is we're dismissing the actual nature of Israel, again, as a settler entity. And what do all settler entities, what is the ultimate goal of every settler entity? It's the eradication of people. It's theft, it's exploitation, it's genocide. So it actually makes complete sense what Israel has been doing over the last 15 months. And we need to speak about it in this way. Because how are we supposed to combat these systems? How are we supposed to combat the systems and the accomplices of Israel, for example, if we are unintentionally legitimizing them with the way that we speak about them and the way that we engage with them?
Excellent. I think that's quite important for the viewers to take on board. Know who you're dealing with. Don't unintentionally get duped into a narrative which they want you to follow, and then you're having a conversation on another level when that's not actually who you're talking to. Talk to Israel for who they are. Zarefah, if I could segue to another question, we've just got over a minute left. Just so viewers outside the US can get an idea or an understanding, what's the mood in the US like, especially related to Palestine with Donald Trump incoming? What's the mood like amongst the pro-Palestinian movements, the Muslim community? What's the sentiment like?
Right. I think it's an interesting time. And I think depending on where in the US you ask, the sentiment would be different. I think overall for a lot of Palestine activists, there was this feeling of relief that Kamala lost. But now we're having to deal with the repercussions of another Trump presidency. This, again, is not only impacting Palestine, but there have been immigration raids on many communities around me, on communities across the United States, these people that have stood with us throughout our movement. And so I think right now is going to be a time of recuperation and understanding that now is not a time for taking breaks. We see celebrations in Gaza, we see celebrations in parts of the West Bank, but this is not a time for Americans to be celebrating. We can feel relief that there is a ceasefire. We can feel relief by the successes and the progress that we've made. But I think what we need to also understand is that we should still be feeling shame. It is not a time for celebration for us. These things have been able to occur because American taxpayers have enabled this violence. And our complicity in these systems over time that have created this destructive and violent two-party system where two parties, again, are hell-bent on our destruction and the destruction of so many communities like us. It's time for us to get even more organized. And I think there's a little bit of tension around this too. We don't want people to lose momentum.